And let's get started. The last class on Abraham Part 1. And so I think it ought to be a real interesting class. Buzz, if you'll go ahead and pull up that next, or whoever's back there, pull up the next slide in there. Sometimes you may wonder, how do you do all of this? How do you make these graphs and everything? Well, if I know Adam's age, and then I add to Adam the age of that firstborn child, the secondborn child, the thirdborn child, the fourthborn child, I'm talking not children, but generations, then all of a sudden you add it all up and you know exactly it's 1,656 years. And so you've seen this slide, by the way, and I do have copies. In fact, these copies are being passed out right now, and so there you have 4 maps, 4 charts right now. I do have these full size. If you if you need new glasses, and that would help you, or if you store them in a book somewhere, you'd rather have full size. That's great. But I just thought that this smaller size would be handier. There's page 1, there's page 2. In relationship to that, and so you'll understand that. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But we asked the question, who could have known Adam? And the answer is down. We're not spending much time at all on these slides because you have seen all of these slides. Who could have known Adam? The first 9 generations. If you include Adam in that number, then you've got all the first 9 generations. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah. And this is something we've not emphasized. I think I may have said it one other time. There are 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And so that'll give you some little tidbit to put in there. But Noah's father could have known Adam. Now, I believe the next slide adds the next slide on the screen adds Noah to that, so you can see how close Noah was to being able to know Adam. Did he know Adam? I have no way of knowing that. But you remember in the study of Genesis, we've talked about the beginning of all of these nations, and particularly after they come out of the ark. When you get to Noah and to Noah's son Shem, all of a sudden, this thing explodes. And we'll talk about this a little bit in just a minute. But the question we asked, who could have known Adam? And then the question is, the third slide is, who could Adam have known? I believe that's your second slide on your page. Who could have known, who could Noah have known? And so you look at that chart, and there's the number of years that Noah could have known each of these characters. He could have gone all the way back to Enosh, who is Adam's grandson, could have gone all the way back to Adam's grandson. That's how far back. And he knew every generation. I mean, he knew, is that 7 or 8 generations that he knew? He did not know Enoch because Enoch did not die but was translated up into heaven. And so you've got Noah, and the amazing thing is there was wickedness all over the world, and a lot of these folks were there almost whenever God made that decision to destroy the world. I think we have not pointed out, or we only pointed out one time, do you see how far over the name Methuselah goes? You see how close he gets to the flood? Methuselah dies the year of the flood. And that's all I'm going to say. Methuselah died the same year the flood came. And that's just some interesting tidbits. But I'm telling you, I have really enjoyed making these charts, these charts and everything. And then let's turn our attention, next slide, to Noah. That's not your slide, the one on the screen. And that is Noah. Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So Noah is 600, and when it says after the flood, do you start the clock when the flood came? Or do you stop it when the flood ended? And so I've got a year flexibility in here. I don't know what to do. They were in the ark for about a year. So is he 601 years after the flood? Or, when was the hurricane that came through here? When was Andrew? What year was that? Well, we all know the year, and you think of that hurricane. Do you think about the beginning of it or the end of it? And so Noah, and that's important because, go put the next slide up there. There is Shem, and look at that second individual that's there. And by the way, you should have almost this one in the handout that was passed out, and that is who could have known Noah? Look at Shem. Look how far over his life goes. Shem lives 500 years after the flood. You've got to understand that. That's an amazing thing. And so you look from Noah down, and Noah doesn't know all of these. Can you see how many generations from Noah to Abraham knew Noah? You look down that chart that's there. Did Shem knew him? Yes. What about Arphaxad or Salar, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor? You come down from the death of Noah and look at the bottom name on that list. Abraham could have known Noah. Did he? Well, we said it a moment ago, and that is the matter of all of these generations being spread and the earth being repopulated. And you remember how we talked about all of those nations and the beginning of all those nations? Think of what the world population would have been at that time. And so could he? Well, would you know somebody who lived 10 generations ago, even if you live in the same state with them, you might not have known them. But imagine them being scattered all over the world. And then look at the next slide that has the word Abraham down in the lower right-hand corner. Abraham could have known Noah for 58 years. That's an amazing thing. That you think about Abraham knowing Noah, I don't know that I know of that, okay? I'm serious. I mean, when I was working out these charts, it's just absolutely amazed me. And let me show you how simple it is to do this. When Noah comes out, when Noah comes out of the ark, you've got the flood. You've got Noah's flood. Arphaxad is born 2 years after the flood. How old is Noah? He's 600 years when the flood came. 2 years after the flood, how old would he be? That's not hard, is it? 600 plus 2? He'd be 602. Well, Arphaxad had a son named Salah. That's on the screen. And Arphaxad had that at age 35. How old was Noah when Salah was born? Well, he was 637. And then you add to that Eber, 30 years of age, and Peleg, 34, and Reu, 30, and Serug, 32, and Nahor, 30, and Terah, 29. And all of a sudden, in segments of three generations per century, Noah knows all of these characters. And so you get down all the way to the end of the life of Noah, and you've got the birth of Abraham. Abraham could have known Noah. Now you want to talk about Shem? Look at Shem's life in relationship to that. Look how far Shem's life goes over all of that long period of time, because he lives 500 years after he lives 500 years after the flood. Or 504. He lives 450 years after the flood. Shem does. Look how far over his life extends. And so the reality is, Abraham. You see Abraham's life and in relationship to Tim's life or Shem's life. Abraham was contemporary with with Noah for 58 years, and with Shem for all of his life. You want to go to Isaac? How old is Abraham whenever Isaac is born? He's 100, isn't he? You add 100 years. Are you aware that Isaac could have known Shem? That's an amazing thing, and that's just tidbits. I hope you've not been bored by doing this. The Bible talks about every scribe instructed in the kingdom, and I'm not a scribe, but I am in the kingdom. He brings out to his guests things old and new. And I think that's one of the keys to good preaching, is to preach things that are simple, that you already know, and it's good to have your memory refreshed, to be reminded of these things, and then to bring out some things that you may never have thought of. And this thing about the overlapping of lives is that. Now let's get to the life of Abraham. We read about Abraham is the central figure in the Old Testament. And we've shown these slides before, but just to reemphasize and to introduce today's lesson, Abraham is mentioned 312 times in the Bible. He's mentioned in 17 Old Testament books and 11 New Testament books. That's 28. That's well more than a third of 56, isn't it? Abraham is all the way through the Bible. He is a central character in the Old Testament. Now there is that threefold promise that God made to Abraham. You're only 12 chapters in the book of Genesis. You have covered, 2,000 years nearly. When you get to Abraham, you did it in 11 chapters. That's the amazing thing. And so God comes and calls Abraham, and 2,000 years of history have passed. And he makes a promise to Abraham that is so important. Now that same promise is made to Isaac and to Jacob. And we changed the slide from what we've had last week. We now have the verses in there where those promises are listed. Genesis 12, 3 through 4. God makes the promise to Abraham, does it in chapter 18, does it in chapter 22. And then when you get to chapter 26, this same promise in almost the same words is made to Isaac. And then when you get to Jacob, and that's in Genesis chapter 28, verse 14, the same promise is made to Jacob. This promise is a pivotal part of the Bible. You need to at least have the concept, if not the actual memory, of saying these are the three parts of the promise God made to Abraham. It is the story of the Old Testament. And it is the story, the introductory story to the New Testament. The threefold promise. Now, what's the promise? I will make of you a great nation. There's the first promise. I will put this great nation in a great land. And in you and your seed shall all the families, all the nations of the earth be blessed. And we've got on the bottom line up there on the screen, Galatians 3:16, who looks back at that promise in the Old Testament and says, you see that word in your seed? The word seed there is not plural. The Jewish mind was, we are God's chosen people, and the whole world is to be blessed through us. They forgot about the Gentiles. We're better than the Gentiles. And that's why when the church begins, you've got that Jewish-Gentile problem. Sort of a racial problem. It was more of ethnicity and religious division that came about. But the Jew says, we are the blessing through whom God is going to bless the earth. No, that's not the reality. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, the New Testament, the Holy Spirit of God says, look back in the Hebrew Bible, and in the Hebrew Bible you will see the word seed is singular. Not in your descendants with an S on it, but in your descendant ending with a T. all the families of the earth will be blessed. And that's what the story of the Old Testament is. It is the story of God making a great nation of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, we're not to the point yet, it'll be in part 2 of the study, of talking about when God changed Jacob's name. He changed Abraham's name. Abraham's original name, you remember what it was? It was Abram. And he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. God changed Jacob's name. From Jacob, what's Jacob's other name? Israel. And so when you read the children of Israel, don't just think, well, the Jews went down to the land of Egypt. The children of Israel went down into the land of Egypt. Guess what? Israel himself, Jacob himself, in the latter part of his life, went down into Egypt. And so you've got the descendants of Israel down to the land of Egypt. They're made to be slaves. What nation comes out? Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. I would just urge you not to think, well, he led the Jewish nation out of Israel. That's true. But if you want to understand the theme of the Bible, he led the descendants of Israel, the children, the genealogy of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And so when you read in the Bible in the Old Testament about the children of Israel, do not just think of that as a name of a nation. It's a description of their origin, and so God changed their name. Jacob's name was originally Jacob, and it comes from his birth. There were twins inside Rebekah's womb, and when the twins were being born, it appeared that the first one to come out would be Jacob, but he was not. It was Esau that came out first. And Jacob, in some way, had a hold of the heel of Esau, and he was named Trickster. Now, supplanter is probably the marginal reading. A supplanter, somebody who supplants someone. And throughout the early part of his life, that's exactly what he did. You remember he and his mama Rebekah tricked blind Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob and not to Esau. Blessing belonged to Esau. But the supplanter came in, hit his mama, and tricked them. And so God did not want Jacob to be the name of his people. And so he gave them the name Israel. You see the E-L at the end of that? That's one of the ways the Bible describes God. On the cross, you remember what Jesus cried out? Eli, Eli. We say Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Eli, God, my God, my God. So in names in the Bible, you'll see E-L so many times at the end of Hebrew names, and it's the word for God, one of the words for God. And it means one who has power with God, the Prince of God, the King of the world, Jehovah God, and there is his Prince, one who has power with God. And so Israel, the nation of Israel was God's chosen nation. And they did have favor with God above others, and God heard their prayers because of their sacrifices and everything, and they had power with God. God changed Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham. Why? Well, the name Abram means exalted father. Exalted father. Can you see how Noah or Adam or Noah would have been an exalted father? And so, you know what the Jews did? They failed to see the significance of Abraham's name changed, and they made him an exalted father. I am the child of Abraham, an exalted father. Remember John the Baptist preaching? John the Baptist said to those Jewish leaders that came out to hear him preach, says, think not to say within your heart, we have Abraham as our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these rocks, these stones, to raise up children to Abraham. You're nothing more than a pile of rocks, even though you are those who have power with God. You're no better than a pile of rocks. I know I've told this before, but I'd love it. Brother Keeble, what he said, you ever see somebody puffed up because they got more money than you and they've got more education than you and all the rest? And you look at them and you feel sort of inferior to them, so look at them again. The Bible said Adam was made of the dust of the ground. Science tells us the human body is 90% water. You know what you get if you mix water and dust together? Mud. That guy that's all puffed up because he's richer than you, got more education than you, Brother Keeble would say, and this is the language he used, he ain't nothing but a mud ball with a necktie on. The next time somebody tries to put you down, just look at their necktie and remember what Brother Keeble said. God said, that's not who I want to lead these people. Abraham means the father of many nations. And that's the thing the Jews failed to learn almost from the very beginning. We're God's chosen people, and we can live just about any way we want to because we're the children of God, and so we have favor with God, and so they made God the father of the Jewish nation. No, that's when you've got an exalted father. Abraham is the father of the multitudes, the father of many nations. And so he said, in thy seed shall the Jewish nation be blessed. Oh no, in thy seed shall all the families, all the nations of the world be blessed. And guys, that's the story of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is how do we get from the promise God made to Abraham and get all the way to the coming of that great seed. Well, let's talk about the beginning of that nation. Look at this overview of the life of Abraham, and this is some new material, or at least outlined in a different form. Abraham was in Ur when God called Abraham. We'll look at a map in just a minute. But Ur was an ancient city, a very modern city. Some of the houses had 4,000 square feet in it. How many square feet you got in your house? 2,000, maybe. If you've got a mobile home, a whole lot less than that. We're down to 1,000 or less. Yeah, 4,000 square feet, and had indoor plumbing. So Abraham comes to Sarah and says, "Hey, by the way, we're moving out of Palm Beach, and we're getting an RV, and we're going to live in a tent the rest of our lives." And so Abraham leaves, he gets that promise, and he leaves, and he goes from Ur to Haran. Look at the map that's on the screen. We know that the call was made in Ur, not from reading the Old Testament. When you're in reading Genesis, you read Genesis 5, and Abraham was already in Haran, or Genesis 11, Abraham was already in Haran when you get to chapter 12, and God calls him a second time. But in Acts, Stephen says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. Meso meaning the middle. Potamia, you know this word from hippopotamus. hippopotamus. You know what hippopotamus means? A river horse. Mesopotamia, the middle of the rivers. You see on the map, you see the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers? Those two rivers are mentioned as being a part of that one river that came out of the Garden of Eden. And so you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates that are mentioned back over in Genesis chapter 2. And in between that was a land called the middle of the rivers, Mesopotamia. It's got many other names. We do not call it Ur of Mesopotamia. We called it Ur of the Chaldees. That's where the Chaldeans were. It's where Babylon is. And so on the map, you've got that journey of Abraham from Ur up to Haran. I think it is rather interesting that his father went with him, and his brother went with him up to Haran. But when Terah dies, Abraham then goes down into the promised land, and he sojourns there. He doesn't have property there. He's a sojourner. And as a sojourner, God set the boundaries of the promised land. Now, this promise, as you read the book of Genesis, over and over again, you'll read God reiterating and restating the promise that He made to Abraham. He told Abraham when Lot took the choicest part of the land, you remember that story about Lot choosing the well-watered, beautiful plains of Jordan, and Abraham, he and his herdsmen had to stay in the mountains. You remember that story? Lot departs and moves down toward Sodom, and God says, oh, by the way, Abraham, just walk all over this land. And every place that your foot travels, every piece of ground that your foot travels, I'm going to give to you and your descendants. But as a sojourner, and when he died, he had no land at all on which to bury his wife. He's a sojourner, nomadic in a sense, but very, very rich. And so he goes from Haran, look at the next map, he goes down into that promised land, and on this particular map, the word Canaan is found there. While he is in Canaan, look at the next slide, and then we'll come back to this slide. God said on that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, to your descendants, plural, I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And then he mentions these names, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, and you've heard me say, and Brother Keeble said, and all those other ites. That's people that lived in that land. Now then, go back to the previous slide. I think it is go to the next slide. I'd forgotten. I had put on that next slide the river of Egypt. It's very, very difficult to see. It's not on many maps. When you read the river of Egypt, you might think the Nile River. But there's a smaller river, not named the Nile, called the River of Egypt. And I don't know if you can see the little small blue line there that is indicative of that. But that is the boundaries of the promised land. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of this land I'm going to give to you and to your descendants. From the river of Egypt all the way up to the river Euphrates. Now, as far as locating it on a map and seeing the actuality of it, you need to look at if you've got a map in the back of your Bible of the extent of the reign of Solomon. Not just to the river Euphrates, but down in Saudi Arabia. You see the Arabian desert? All the way down in there. The Queen of Sheba, guess where she lived? Well, that's just the northern edge of Saudi Arabia. You go down to the southern extremity, and that's where Sheba was. And she'd heard of the grandeur of Solomon and came to investigate the wisdom of Solomon. most powerful, most man of renown of his generation. God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I'm going to give you this land. Now the question is, why did not God take this land and give it to Abraham himself? That's a good question. Why was it that he said, your descendants are going to go down in the land of Egypt, and they will be there. They'll be there for 400 years. They'll serve. They'll be bond servants for 400 years. And so he says, when they come out, they will come out with great wealth. How can a nation of slaves come out with great wealth? Because after the last plague, the death of the firstborn, they demanded, the King James renders that word borrowed, they demanded of the Egyptians, give us your jewelry and everything. And so in that sense, the Egyptians made them a wealthy nation. And so the Lord said, I'm going to take this land away from these people, but there is a reason why I am not going to take this land and why they're having to go down into that land. And the reason is that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. You know one of those ites that lived in that land? The Canaanites, Jebusites, and all the other ites that were there. One of the ites in that land were the Amorites. Who owned that land? Well, God owned the land, but the Amorites possessed it. And I remember as a child in Bible school, when I'd read about, they came in and they took the houses they had not built, and they took vineyards they had not planted. And I didn't verbalize this to anyone, but I just, my infantile mind said, that's not fair. Those folks spent all their life putting all that together, and God took it away from them. Well, that is true, that they had worked and they had built that. Whose land was it? You know Psalms 100. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the fullness of it. If you had rental property, and people were not treating your rental property, how tolerant would you be? You know, they didn't mow the lawn, and they kept just throwing, jacking up cars and put them on concrete blocks out in the front yard. You understand what I mean? And you look at it, I wish they wouldn't do that. I wish they wouldn't do that. And finally, the point arrives when you said, get out of here. Why didn't you do that at first? Because the iniquity of the tenants was not yet full. God said, it is not just for me to take this land from these Canaanite nations until they have forfeited the right to this land. Now, we don't have time to look at it, but the Lord tells the Jews, before you ever get to the promised land, you need to understand that if you go in there and live like these Canaanite nations did, the land is going to vomit these Canaanites, all of these otherites. The land is going to vomit them out. Why? It's holy land. It belongs to God. And you have polluted it so much, the land itself is going to vomit you out, vomit these nations out. And then he says to the Jews, and you be careful, because you got in there and you live like they did, the land will vomit you out. You read Deuteronomy chapter 28, and you'll understand why there is no Jewish nation day. Read all of chapter 28. I'll scatter you all over the world, and every place you go, you'll be hated. You'll find no rest, you'll find no peace, and all you've got to do is be a student of history to learn about the Holocaust, to learn about all of the wars that is going on right now between the descendants of the Jews who are trying to live over in that land and the descendants of the ites who are in that land. you'll never have rest. In the evening you say, oh, that it were morning. And in the morning you'll say, oh, that it were evening. And God said, that's what's going to happen to you. Why? Because they went into the land, and since they had been God's chosen people, God brought an even greater judgment against them because of the opportunity that they've had. So now they're there in that promised land. Abraham is a sojourner. You've got to keep that in mind. There's a famine. You see the word Egypt? Go back to that, leave the other slide up for just a minute, the previous slide. You see where Egypt is? There's a famine in the promised land. And sometimes we try to help God solve His problems. You ever done that? Got a situation in your life? I don't see why God doesn't just. And sometimes you don't tell God about it, but I just don't understand why God wouldn't work this out. Why wouldn't God work this out? Well, Abraham is in that promised land, and there's a famine. How's that land described as they head out of Egypt, going up to that land? It's a land that's flowing with what? Milk and honey. There's a famine in the land, and Abraham wants to help God make sure that he survives in a land that flows with milk and honey, because there's a famine in the land. And so what's it? He goes down to the land of Egypt. God doesn't need our help to solve His problems. He doesn't really have any problems. You remember Abraham and Sarah trying to help God solve the problem of Abraham? I'll make of you a great nation. How many children does Abraham have? 0. So Sarah works with Abraham and says, let's figure out a way to give you a descendant. And so Hagar, and we're a little bit ahead where I want to be right now, but God, Abraham and Sarah try to help God solve His problems. God doesn't need help solving your problems. You need to understand that. That doesn't mean you sit back and do nothing. You know, the two little boys were being chased by a lion, and one of them said to the other, let's stop and pray. And the other said, oh no, let's run and pray. And God doesn't need your help, but God can use. But they're really trying to help God out. We don't want to starve. And you remember that trouble he got with Pharaoh? You remember before he ever gets down to the land of Egypt, what does it say? What does it say to this 75-year-old woman? You are so beautiful. There aren't very many beautiful 75-year-old women. And he says, when the Egyptians see you, they will want you. And so gets down into that land, and sure enough, when the Egyptians see the beauty that Sarah has, they go tell the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh takes Sarah to his own house. And when God brings this to Pharaoh's mind, Pharaoh says, what have you done? I have taken the wife of another man. I've taken your wife. What did Abraham say? She is my what? Sister. I think she's about a half sister, isn't she? Something like that. But she's not a full sister. A half truth is a full lie. You got to understand that. And so God works that out, and they come back into the promised land. Happens again, by the way, and he goes down to where Abimelech is. Twice Abraham does that. And Abraham does it. Isaac is in the land. There's a famine in the land. You know what Isaac tells God to do? God says to Isaac, don't you go down into the land of Egypt. I find that absolutely amazing. Now, the next generation, Joseph and Jacob went down into the land of Egypt because the Lord said, the iniquity of the Amorites is not full. I'm not taking your descendant. I'm not giving you this land. I'll give it to you, but first they must spend 400 years and become slaves in another land. And so that's why you've got the Exodus. And when you get to the Exodus, now all of a sudden, instead of being Abraham's or being Jacob's 70 descendants, 70, instead of being a nation of 70 descendants, there are so many Jews. After 400 years, they have an army that has over 600,000 soldiers in it. That's amazing, isn't it? Just an amazing thing. I'll make of you a great nation. It was a great nation that came out of the land of Egypt. Now then, there's this problem of Lot, and we in Genesis 14, let's go ahead and look at the rescue of Lot and the meeting of Melchizedek. Abraham's nephew is Lot. He's trying to take care of Lot. And there are 5 kings that come and they attack the area where Lot is living, down around Sodom. And so Abraham takes his household and forms an army out of them. How many slaves you got in your household? Well, forget the microwave and forget the washing machine and all the rest. But you understand? His household, those that sat at his table. Slaves is not the exact word used to describe it, but those that were part of Abraham's life and that he took care of. There were 318 servants. And Bill Jr., you're the one, I think, that called that to my attention that said, in his house. What about those that were not in his house? I owe you a debt for looking at it and seeing it that closely. But he arms his soldiers, and with just a very few hundred people, he goes out and defeats 5 kings and rescues Lot. And Abraham comes back having rescued Lot, and on his way back he meets a man by the name of Melchizedek, who is a priest of the Most High God. This doesn't sit with our view of the patriarchal age where he spoke to the fathers and it was only through the fathers. There were priests of God in the patriarchal age. And when I say that and you've got a question, the answer is, I don't know the answer to your question. I just know there were priests during that time. And Abraham does an amazing thing. Abraham gives a tithe, a tenth of the spoils, to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek pronounces a blessing upon Abraham. You remember how the fathers would call their children together and pronounce a blessing upon them? Think about Jacob when he blessed his sons before he died. Here's Melchizedek blessing Abraham. The book of Hebrews says, wait a minute. The blessing is given by the greater one individual. The lesser one is blessed by the greater. Who's greater? Abraham or Melchizedek? We don't think of that in that terminology, but that's the argument that Hebrews makes. And then there's an amazing twist that is made, because in the genetics of Abraham is a several generation grandson named Levi. The Levitical priesthood genetically gave tithes to Melchizedek, which is the greater priesthood. Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood. And the book of Hebrews makes this argument that therefore Jesus is a high priest, not of the tribe of Levi, but a priest like Melchizedek, a priest of the Most High God after the order of Melchizedek. Well, that's it. There'll be part 2 of the book of Genesis, and part 2 we'll take up right here and start talking about Abraham, offspring Isaac, and so many of these stories you know well. I would really encourage you to read the book of Genesis. I think your life would be enriched, and you'll see things in it you've never seen before. Thank you very much.